So I suppose one of the interesting questions that a lot of the Irish dissident right would have, or a lot of people might have in general actually, to be honest with you, is why did Ireland collapse so quickly? Why did Ireland, in the space of about 20 years, go from a fairly kind of conservative-y kind of place to voting in gay marriage in 2015 and abortion in 2018? Why is it that the Irish are so subservient, and why is it that they like being told what to do? Why is it that the Irish always try and define themselves in relation to some big other? And why is it that they're this interest or this kind of obsession with like the European Union, that kind of thing? Well, I think there's a number of good reasons for this, and a lot of them are combined into the excellent book, The Broken Harp by Tomas Maxiamon. And I highly recommend this book because it really does argue well why the Irish are the way that they are, why they act like this psychologically. And in the next video in this series, I'm going to go into the more statistics, epigenetic stuff that Tomas Maxiamon goes into. But this one is kind of a more historical / status video. So with that, I'm going to focus on 3 chapters in this book: the first colonization of the Irish mind, the second colonization of the Irish mind, and the third colonization of the Irish mind. So with that, let's get into it. So the first thing is that one of the big defining sequence of events was the end of Gaelic hegemony that occurred in the at the start of the 17th century. So you had the failed Earl of Kildare rebellion, and earlier on, and then you had King Henry VIII declaring himself King of Ireland in the mid 1530s. You had the various plantations. You had the plantation of Leash Offaly, you had the plantation of Munster, and then the big one, the plantation of Ulster in 1609. You had the Battle of Kinsale in 1601 that failed, and you had the O'Neills and the O'Donnells, the flight of the Earls in 1607. So by that period in time, the Irish were essentially a much more kind of weakened, defeated force. And what Maxiamon argued, bringing other writers on colonization, he argues that the colonialization process follows an almost inevitable predictive pattern. Colonized subjects are reduced to economic and cultural dependence on their cultural masters. With no help of redressing their woes, they must become resigned to their fate, exhibiting the symptoms of the condition as related to them by the colonizer. So you end up getting stuff like, when people have no confidence like this, they tend to not take risks as much, and they tend to be open more to ideas that kind of, give them comfort or explain that reason that, it's an issue for them. So, like I said before in the video on the Varadkar is attracted to the idea of this big European Union system because it's, like when you don't have confidence and you have this system kind of being able to dictate you and giving you the answer for why you feel an outsider. The same thing basically happened to the Irish. In other words, the Irish, the stereotypes that were kind of perpetuated, like, that the Irish were a lower form of being, that they were gormless, scatterbrained, childlike, incapable of looking after themselves, and needing the benevolent hand of the colonizer. And this is very, very important because Maxiamon makes a really, really good observation in that if people perceive their own group to be low status, they adapt less favourable stereotypes to their own group and more favourable stereotypes to the high status groups. And you can even see that in a lot on how this kind of Bioleninism stuff happens today. So like you'll talk about the negatives of European men a lot, but you won't talk about the negatives of a gay person who does something wrong or an LGBT person who does something wrong. But the main thing behind this, or a big chunk of behind this, is in addition to this kind of low confidence thing, you also got the effect of a sort of proto-Bioleninism, a sort of going for status. So I've argued, or I've talked about in previous videos, that the main driving force, or a big one behind human action, is this, going for status. And high status tends to be associated with the posh, elite, bourgeoisie English, and low status tend to be associated with Irish, people speaking Irish, and Irish workers. So what this did is that if you had, say, like Catholics and Protestants, or English and Irish, being English would give you a artificially high level of status in society, and this would cause Irish people to act more and more English. And you even see this, actually. I mean, there's a fantastic Stanley Kubrick film, Barry Lyndon, and it's literally kind of about that. It's about this kind of displaced Irish, drifting kind of higher peasant kind of guy, and he manages to work his way up into elite society, and he tries to get himself a title by kind of adhering to the social conventions of the time. So and yeah, that what that also results in is sometimes, people disparaging the Irish language. So for example, I mean, there is maybe you can see this a bit recently. So for example, like you see the show, there's a show on a few years ago called No Berla, and it's kind of interesting to watch clips from that, because basically the premise of the show is that the guy talks and tries to do everything in Irish, and it's interesting. Like it isn't just a frustrated I don't understand you response. It's something a bit more troubling, and I think part of this is, there's still a little bit of that ingrained that, it's associated with something outdated. It's associated with something foreign. It's associated with something that, has lost its way, for lack of a better phrase. And, this is one thing. Like, this is where some of the kind of West Brit stuff comes in, or this Anglophile stuff comes in, because essentially a lot of it is a status game. So, and within this colonization process, it tends to follow two phases. The first one is the actual physical withdrawal, and the second one is the breakdown of the colonizers' myth that, you're Irish and you're low status, But unfortunately, like Simon says, and I agree with him, that still seems to be there today. I mean, even stuff like I talked about before, like the use of irony to deconstruct a lot of this stuff, and even stuff like the inevitable like I was just thinking there. Sorry for a little bit of a ramble, but I remember even just like thinking on when I was just about to make this video. Do you ever kind of notice that, like, when like you might be in a shopping market or something like that, or a supermarket, and when you want to get some milk off the shelf, you say, and someone is standing in front of you, you say sorry. Sorry is a weird word to kind of use for something like that, isn't it? I mean, like, it's not like you've done anything wrong. You're just getting some milk, These kind of little things, like they pop up all over the place. But the decline of the Irish language, that really is key, because the thing is, if you, and I really do want to emphasize this point, like, language is not just a method of communication, it's how you see the world. And if you make speaking Irish a low status thing, or turn people away from it more and more and more, people lose their attachment more and more to the land, to their communities, and to the myths involved. And this attempt to shut down the Irish language, this was a very, very long-running thing by the English. So you had the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366, and that tried to ban the whole thing. But outside the Pale, and within Dublin city boundaries, this was never really done. However, following the 16th century Tudor rampage, for lack of a better phrase, this was done more vigorously. So, for example, like even among the English intellectual kind of artists or elites at the time, Edmund Spenser was a poet. Who wrote the Fairy Queen, and he advocated the destruction of the Irish culture and the Irish language by forcing people to adopt English and to discard Irish, so that they would accept the English worldview and basically destroy the Irish worldview. Or even stuff like John Milton used to make propaganda leaflets for Cromwell. At the time, all that kind of stuff was going on. So that there's a little bit of that kind of history there. Like, I mean, even among kind of prominent figures like Daniel O'Connell, the Catholic emancipation individual, he was talking about like he had a bit of a kind of an anti-Gaelic sentiment as well. And the result of all of this is that you had a big decline in the Irish language, especially within the 19th century. Throw in the famine on top of that, and throw in the fact that the primary education system kind of built up by the Brits in 1831 and delivered completely through English. By the end of the 19th century, only about 20% of the population spoke Irish. And even today, it's only about like 0.02%. It's only kind of stuck in those kind of Gaeltacht areas. And in addition to that, Tomás Mac Simón goes into the point that like there was a considerable amount of state indifference to this, and you can see it in the fact that Gaeltacht areas tended to receive very little financial support. They were hardest hit by economic downturns because of globalism and because of Bioleninism. You know, everyone's seeking status. People move to the cities. This area declines. But that was an interesting thing. That, like, apart from like the education system, the state was relatively indifferent to trying to revive the Irish language. And one of the key points, and this might be the most important point in the book for me, is and why we've seen a lot of the things that have happened and why this led to the Catholic Church, is the simple reason that even when the Brits left, and if you took a look at the Free State society at the time and who was running things, who was in your business, who was in your law systems, who was in administration, who was in medicine, who was in science and technology, who was in culture, a huge component of that did not change at all. A huge component of that did not change at all. So even though, you know, you had the Irish Free State and the Brits left and all that kind of stuff, you still had that same blob or same group of individuals running the show. And when you're in those levels of power and status, you want to kind of keep your hands on them. So as a result of that, I think there is a sort of an amalgamation with the Catholic Church, kind of in a sort of a subconscious way, so that these people could basically stay in their roles, in their jobs, you know. And I think one of the kind of saddest things about that is the Irish language tended to blur that a little bit. So, like, in other words, the fact that it was kind of left to the state to do gave people the feeling that, like, we were more free than we were more uncolonized than we actually were, when in fact a lot of the ruling, a lot of the administration, the law systems, all that kind of stuff stayed pretty much exactly the same, which is kind of a depressing thought. And I just want to take a quote from the book that kind of sums that up a bit. So, as depicted memorably in Liam O'Flaherty's The House of Gold, the newborn Irish Free State evolved seamlessly into a British Catholic neo-colony, managed and harmonised by a native comprador capitalist Gombeen class that quickly adapted itself to the role of the displaced Irish Anglo-settler establishment, and by leaving its language through what we Irish have come to imagine ourselves and our culture, the colonial master never really left. So, but hey, talk to Keith Mills or John McGurk, you know. At least we speak English now, and, you know, that people can buy our products, you know. So that's terrific, isn't it? That's something really, really great to keep in mind. So, the next point I just want to get into, part 2 of this, the second chapter, the second colonization of the Irish mind. In this part, Tomás Maximin goes into the interesting part that the religious institutions actually had, and at the time, and you can clearly see this in the writings of the times of like Irish 16th century monks who were exiles on the continent. Like there really was, like, religion was very, very important, but the thing though is that, like, because you had this artificially low level of status in the society, being Irish Catholic, this led to resentment, insurrectionary outbreaks, 1641 rebellion, and then the penal laws in 1701 depriving Catholics of many basic rights. 1728, Catholics did not have the right to vote. Ambitious Irish people went to France or Spain as a result, known as wild geese. But again, this pressure to make, like, Irish religion, Irish culture, a low status thing. But then it kind of got a little bit more interesting then, because in 1795, the English authorities negotiated a concordat with the Vatican. And this led to Maynooth College being started in 1795. Now, the interesting thing about Maynooth is that it has a clerical origin, and it was to be taught exclusively through the English language. And the Irish Roman Catholic Church were happy to go along with this Anglicization, and the masses were correspondingly spoken in English. And this goes even deeper and deeper. So, I mean, even stuff like the national anthem being a borrowed Methodist hymn, or the fact that the Roman Catholic Church, according to the book, ignored the kind of Gaelic architectural tradition, and as it embarked on its church building in 1829, and it was based on the British Gothic revival. Irish Gaelic saints were promoted less and less in church design, and French saints were put in, and traditional Gaelic prayers were discouraged by the clergy. And even stuff like devotional revolution, like, you know, there was this attempt to impose Roman devotional orthodoxy on worshippers, and kind of more pagan rituals that were kind of brought up were not encouraged as much as well. You know, just even back to the architecture thing, it reminds me of something that John Waters was saying. Like, you know, I think a tourist went up to him and said, like, you know, oh, I love these Georgian brick houses. And, you know, I think John Waters said something along the lines of, yeah, but, like, you know, are they really ours? Like, you know, and there's a lot of this that has just happened, like, again and again and again. And this all built up. And as a result, as I was talking about with the status structural issue of the Free State, the Catholic Church ends up brought in to kind of bolster that. And to quote Max Schiamon, promoted a dogmatic, controlling, intellectually stifling, conformist Irish culture. And I just wanna go on a little bit of a side bit here, which is basically that. Look, I didn't grow up in that time. You know, I'm in my late 20s. I've heard people, well, late 20s to early 30s. I've heard people, you know, say, you know, come out with absolute horror stories, all that kind of stuff. And, you know, it really was that, like, you know, like chapter 3 in the fucking Portrait of the Artist, you know, the big long description of, like, what hell is like, you know. This wasn't like Neo-Thomism, like, this was like a real controlling, you know, if you do this kind of thing, you'll go to hell. So, and even if you take a look at like immigration numbers, you know, in a lot of ways, like Catholic Ireland wasn't a great place. But I just want to kind of emphasize a couple of things there. I mean, the first thing I want to emphasize is, I think one of the problems that a lot of Irish people might have is that, and it's a lot of, is that just because the Catholic Church did something does not mean at all it was automatically bad. If they did something, or if they said something, or if they encouraged something, doesn't necessarily mean it is automatically bad. It's like the way that, like, I mean, Keith Woods has talked about this in terms of, like, you know, just because you might have an interest in environmentalism or climate change or whatever, you know, it doesn't make you a lefty. Like, you can be open to these kind of ideas. And for a lot of Irish people, just because the Catholic Church did something doesn't mean it was necessarily a bad thing. And even, like, I have to ask myself kind of an objective enough question here, like, who's better off? Take your average, take a 30-year-old woman living in 2020 Ireland, and woman or man, and a average 30-year-old woman or man living in 1960. Okay? In 1960, those people would have been married. They would have had a couple of kids. They would have had a community where, like, oh, the Murphys are the next door down, the Browns are 2 doors down. They would have owned their own car. They would have owned their own house. They would have been, well, they probably would have owned their own house. They would have been poor. They would have been poor. And they would have some sort of a spiritual culture, and they would have belonged. I mean, I remember a story from even stuff like a bit older than my parents, like, and he was just telling me, like, you know, like in some places in rural Ireland, it would just be like kids would just kind of go out and just play and have fun for the whole day, and just come back, and no one was worried about it because everyone knew each other and everyone kind of to some degree understood each other. And now compare that to today. That 30-year-old couple, like, you know, they won't be getting a house. If they have a car, they're fucking paying a huge amount on the insurance. They're probably going to have a more nihilistic existence of watching Netflix and going to some club and drinking a shit ton of pints. You know, when people say Catholic Ireland was bad, I mean, I've no problem pointing out all these problems, as Tomás Mac Siúrmán does, but is what we have now better? Honest question, like, is what we have now better? And I'm not so sure about that. So finally, just to wrap up, after this definition of the big other, you know, the defining, you know, this big institution telling us what to do, you know, with the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church coming in stronger and stronger as a way of, I think, keeping a lot of the top lads happy. The Catholic Church's threshold on Ireland began to break down in the 60s and the 70s. I mean, you can put multiple events in this. You know, Charles McQuaid dying in 1972 might be one, or the start of RTE, or Sean Lemass opening the economy more to international capital. But whatever it was around then that the Catholic Church's influence started to break down, and you ended up like you had this invasion or absorption by the Irish psyche of these contemporary consumerist values that arrived as both overt and subliminal components of the cultural products referred to above. So what this led to in relation to the kind of low confidence stuff and a lack of a system telling you what to do is a massive ideological vacuum. And what was this filled by? This is filled by the European Union. This is filled by this sort of global homoculture. This was filled by progressivism. And because the connection with the community, the land, and the further decrease of the Irish language, people started to attach themselves more and more and more onto TV shows, football teams, pop culture personalities, video games, all that kind of thing. And you know, you see this as well. I mean, it always kind of annoyed me. This kind of like, I remember a few years ago, Barack Obama came here, and you know, I mean, I'm just kind of referencing Keith Woods' video, "Why Ireland Collapsed So Quickly." Fuck, I should have said that actually. Like that video was basically the kind of inspiration for this one, and I'm just kind of backing up Keith Woods here a bit. That like, you know, it was really cringeworthy when Obama came here because people were, you know, people went out to him in droves, and people were treating him like he was almost this kind of messianic kind of figure, and it was like, you know, like, this is not even a political thing. Like, you know, you can respect people and you can really respect men, but like, there's a difference between respecting a man and, you know, turning him into, you know, a god. And I hate that shit. And the Irish do it a lot. Like, you know, they do it a lot, you know. And this, I really do have to emphasize this low confidence thing, this lack of a core identity thing. It's a real problem, and it has done damage again and again and again. I mean, even the case with you know, the 2008 collapse, like, you know, like the madness that was going on in Anglo-Irish Bank, the 64 billion in debt that we took on, whereas the Iceland just went, no, you're going to jail, but we happily took on all that banking debt, you know, like. And then, you know, I remember kind of even the time, you know, or the kind of attitude now a bit more of the Celtic Tigers, like, oh, we were, you know, we partied too hard and we were idiots, you know. And, you know, maybe there is a bit of that, but at the same time, like, there is another component to it, like, which is the supply of just cheap credit to the Irish banking system. Like, it's not just an Irish problem, and it seems to be treated more and more like it is, which is, you know, which is sad, really. Which is sad. And I think that's where I'm going to wrap it up for the first part, for the first part here. I'll talk more about the statistics, genetics, epigenetic stuff that Maxime Mon goes into in the next video. I highly recommend this book. I cannot recommend this book enough. This is a really, and it's a short enough read too, book on how to understand, like, why I think, and I agree with him, the Irish are the way that they are, and what we can use to predict how the Irish are going to act in the future. And my prediction is, if the Irish don't get over this, like, lack of confidence or lack of identity kind of thing, then we're going to be in big trouble, because all it's going to take is a big outside system to come along, and that outside system might not have our interests in mind whatsoever.